So I want to talk to you about timelines. Our final project in Type 1 will be a timeline of typography, a timeline of important events in typographic history. The range of your timeline will be up to you, and the contents of your timeline will be up to you, and the design will be up to you. Before we get into specifically what you're going to do, though, I want to talk to you about some timelines. So before the examples, let's talk about what a timeline does. A timeline presents information in a context of time. That context could be a few hours, it could be a few days, it could be a year, it could be 1,000 years. The amount of time varies on what you're trying to convey. And it can give a better picture of events than a list does sometimes, or than a story does sometimes. It is not, a timeline is generally not good for an in-depth dive into information. It's generally better for showing how events interrelate over time. So as you look at these examples, I want you to think about a few things. First of all, time is only one dimension. What else does each timeline communicate in addition to time? Is a historical picture presented along with the details? And I think that this is a very good measure of how well a timeline works. Is it all about the individual details, or does it give you an overall historical picture? Does the design serve the content? This specifically means is something designed just to look cool, or does it really have something to do with the content? Does it really have something to do with the information that's trying to the designer is trying to present? The latter is your goal, is the goal of any design. And lastly, not all the examples I'm going to show you will do the best job in every aspect. This is important to note. I'm showing you some examples where I think it does one thing well and it does other things poorly. So think critically about these examples. And when I say think critically, that is beyond just I like it, I don't like it. Critical thinking in terms of design means, well, it does this part of its job well, it communicates this well, it communicates that poorly. Think critically, think about what could be better, and how you would make it better. All right, so our first example. This is a timeline that covers 4 days of history. And those 4 days are the original Woodstock concert in 1969, which, at least in the United States, have come to be viewed as a very historic event. I have the 4 days here, and you can also see that this was originally designed very large. It may look sort of informationally dense on your screen, but it is designed, if you look at that scale photo, it looks like it's at least 8 or 9 feet tall. This is a detail of the first day. And what I find remarkable here is that they have used this graphic device of splitting the day, and that diagonal line carries down as the timeline. So the timeline itself is just implied. You can see that there is a summary overview up at the top of text. On the right hand, in the middle of the diagonal line, we have the actual time of the day and the performer. Um, on the right, we actually have their set list, what songs they played. On the left, um, we have a description of what was actually going on at the concert. This is a timeline that an Etsy seller did. All of their Etsy sales from February 2007 to May 2009. Um, and you may notice this actually doesn't give us a great sense of time, other than we know it's between within this year and a half or so. But what it does give us is a picture of which items were sold where in the world. Which of the seller's items were more popular in different places. Um, Now, unfortunately, I don't have the resolution on this chart to really zoom in and see what the different items are, but whatever the blue item is, it is much more popular in North America and the Caribbean than anywhere else in the world. Whatever that red item is, or that blood red item, I should say, that burgundy color, that is also only popular in North America. So this is a very interesting use of an infographic to separate out. The seller might be able to use this information if they want to target specific markets. This is a timeline about His Highness the Aga Khan IV. I do not know who Aga Khan IV is, what country he is the king of, but this is a timeline chronicling his awards and honors. And as you can see, this is a very complicated timeline. If we zoom in a little bit, you can see there's a straightforward timeline on the bottom, and then on the top they had to call out so many different items and so many photos of this person meeting different heads of state and other important people. It is so complicated that it becomes somewhat useless as a timeline. This is an example of where a much more simplified timeline would actually give you a better picture. This is too much information to process visually. I think that this would be better designed as a straightforward historical story or infographic that is paired with a more simplified timeline. So, great example of getting too complicated in a timeline. This is a timeline of releases for Drupal, which is a content management system software. And I think that this is an example of going the other direction, that this is too simple. We have our different software releases called out on the timeline, and when you look at version 1 and version 2, version 3, version 4, versions 1, 2, and 3 make perfect sense. They were released at these different times. Version 4, we start splitting to 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, 4.4, etc. This is where it gets kind of confusing. So, up until 2002, each event on the timeline is a discrete version number. After 2002, each event on the timeline becomes a decimal number of that version number. So between 2002 and 2005, we're all dealing, 2006. I'm sorry, 2007, we were dealing with the decimal 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, etc. So why isn't that one long timeline? Why isn't that a secondary timeline? Then we go to, and we also have some overlap, which is a little confusing. I'm not a software developer, so I don't know. Perhaps software developers do actually continue working on an older version when they're already developing a newer version. Um, I don't know why they would. According to this timeline, they were still working on version 4.4 when version 4.5 was already at 4.5.4. I'm not sure why that is. Um, and the same with 4.6. They had apparently already started version 4.6 while they were still working on version 4.4.3. Maybe this is actually how they work. Maybe this is accurate, but because we have these sort of branching timelines, it gets very, very confusing. Um, and yet it looks very simple. So I think this is an example of something that is not giving us quite enough information or explanation of what's going on. This is not a beautifully designed timeline at all. In fact, I'd say this is kind of boring and ugly. Um, but this is a very straightforward timeline design. This is what I would call a very classic timeline design, and it communicates the information quite well. You'll notice that um, it alternates up, down, top, bottom. Each event is called out in a box. So 1980 is up above the timeline, 1981 is below, 1982 is above, 1989 is below, etc., etc. This is a great method for saving space, is that you can work on both sides of your timeline, and it becomes fairly easy to follow if you design it well. So again, I don't think this is a particularly stunning design by any means, but it communicates the information well. Here's an example of someone designing a timeline creatively. And this is a very condensed time scale. This is, I believe it's only about a month. But it talks about the Euro economic crisis that happened a few years ago, where the euro, the currency, plummeted in value over the course of a very short period of time. And the designer of this timeline sort of took a cue from board games, I think, but they also made this spiraling timeline that is, it's almost as if it's going down the drain, which is sort of an editorial message about what was happening to the euro during this time. This is great to illustrate a magazine story or a piece of journalism. What this doesn't do very well is this can't really give you a continued picture beyond the end of the timeline. In fact, it distorts reality a little bit because it gives you this picture of going down the drain and things were at the end, and that's it. Which, of course, we know that's not how time works. It keeps going, no matter what. No matter how bad things get, if we're still here reading the timeline a couple years later, well, that means, the sun came up the next day and people went on with their lives. So this doesn't, specifically here, this doesn't give us a good picture of what happened after the euro hit its lowest point. How did people recover? This is a timeline of the Green Line, which is part of the greater Boston public transit system. And it's basically about trying to develop and run this particular branch. And it uses the design vernacular of a transit map. They made it look like a line map. Except all the stops on here are actually. Excuse me, sorry. All the stops on your line are actually dates. This timeline is the evolution of the telephone. And this is 400 years. This starts in the 1600s. Excuse me. This starts in 1664, runs through 2009. So this is a huge historical overview of the telephone. But you can see that in addition to the very simple timeline, we're covering 400 years and we only have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 18 events in 400 some odd years. That's what I'd call a simplified timeline. But up at the top, they actually talking about the current status of mobile telephones and telephones in general in 2007 when this was made. So they are adding additional information to the timeline. Here is a much smaller and more specific timescale timeline that is about the invention of the iPhone. So this runs 1999 through 2008. So it covers less than a decade. It covers 9 years. It goes from Apple first registering iPhone.org to the release of the iPhone 3G. So, this timeline is now 4 years out of date, 6 years out of date, I should say. But this is the opposite of the timeline before in that it is a very, very short timeline. It is a very specific timeline. It is not about voice communication as a whole. It is not about mobile telephones as a whole. It's not even about smartphones as a whole. It's about one particular brand of smartphone, the iPhone. And it's not even the whole story because time has marched on since 2008. This is a fun one for anyone here who likes all the comic book movies that have been coming out the past few years. This is a timeline of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And you can see it covers a few days, and in true comic book style, they didn't actually give dates because they don't want this to become dated any more quickly than it has to. So they're just talking about days in relation to each other within a couple of movies. So I believe they're talking about the Iron Man movies, the Thor movies, the Avengers movie, Captain America movie, I think, and how these events all relate to each other. And they use the symbols for each of these superhero characters or each film. This is a much more corporate event. This is a corporate timeline of some sort from somebody's annual report. But what I think is interesting here is they, they decided they don't need the arrow. We all know which way time goes. They have a list of events, and then they have these colored boxes that uh, pull up or down out of the events list, out of the timeline itself, and help to frame photographs. So this is an example of what could have been a fairly boring timeline, and it's presented in really quite nice way um, through the use of graphic design. That's the power of graphic design for us. This is an example. This is a timeline of online poker um, services. And the whole timeline is up at the top, and then a detail is down at the bottom, a detail of a few years. And I thought this is a really excellent use of a timeline graphic. Instead of just having discrete events one after the other, they actually show the rise and fall of each of these services. Um, so each colored uh, wave, for lack of a better word, is a different online service. And of course, it has 0 members when it launches, but the membership rises and falls, and we have many of these different online poker services functioning concurrently. So I think even within a timeline, when it's presenting historical context, if it's a set of discrete events on a line, we tend to see them as then this happened, then it was over, then this other thing happened, then that was over. And this does a great job of explaining to us, no, these things overlap. Just because a new service was launched, it doesn't mean the existing services died out. They were still there. They're still going strong. This is a fairly interesting one. They've kind of done 2 axes of information. So this is from, I'm betting it's from a corporate annual report. It's the timeline of SAP. And you'll notice on the left, they have 2 vertical callouts. One is 1946 to 1980. So, 34 years of this company's history. Then 1980 to 2010. So 30 more years of the company's history. So that's, what's that, 64 years of the company's history? 74, actually. Condensed into the left-hand, quarter, 20% of this whole chart. And then it starts with 2011, 2012. So the majority of the space in this timeline was taken up from the events from happening within 1 year, just a little over 1 year, May 2011 to June 2012. Because that is what they wanted to talk about. But they wanted to talk a little bit about the company's history. So this is what I would say is an interesting example of a dual axis. We have time going vertically at first, and then it goes horizontally. This is a timeline of video games. This is a fun one. They used a lot of great images of old retro systems and 8-bit graphics and all kinds of fun stuff. Now, for anyone who knows anything at all about video games, you will notice something, that this is far from a complete list. This does not list every piece of video game hardware ever made, not by a long shot. This does not list every video game ever released. Obviously not. But what it does give you is an interesting overview. And this is relevant to our project in that we can't really include every event in typographic history in a timeline, you have to pick and choose. So what tells the most compelling story? This is a timeline. The time scale runs vertically along the left-hand side. This is the largest bankruptcies in history. And they used the very funny and sort of morbidly funny graphic of a sinking ship. So the size of the ship is how much the company was worth when it went bankrupt. And they also just call out the specific name and the valuation of each company with a little flag coming off the boat as it sinks under the waves. So the line for each year also doubles as a representation of waves or water. So this is a fun one. Now I want to talk about a few timelines that are doing what you need to do in this project, which is they are talking about typography. These are specific typography timelines. So this one, they wanted to fit a bunch of events. It went from 1800 BC, which is pretty far back, up through 1996. And this would be a very long, thin poster, but this designer decided to have the timeline do a sort of snaky curve, sort of a reverse S, or the shape of a number 2, even. And all the events fold in on themselves, fold over as the line folds. So this is a great way to make something that is very linear work in a space that is not suited for it. This is a much more graphic approach. So this designer broke out the history of type into a few trends in type design, similar to similar to the typeface classifications that we learned. They broke it out into typefaces that relate to specific art movements, 20th and 21st century art movements. I think there are quite a few problems with this. One is relating type specifically to art movements is always a little difficult. Type design is often influenced by art movements going on around them, but it has its own design history as well, that isn't necessarily related to trends in visual arts. The second is actual readability, legibility of this. You have to go across these long vertical stripes to read anything. I think that the designer was more interested in creating this cool rotating rainbow graphic than they were in actually making the information readable. So that's an important thing to remember. Don't sacrifice legibility and readability for a cool idea. This designer designed a timeline typography in early modernism. They're talking about a very specific period of time that was the early part of the 20th century, and how events in typography relating to the modernist movement. And they designed this poster to mimic a lot of the poster and informational designs that the modernists used. They used the Futura typeface, which is very relevant to the modernist movement. They used this black and red color palette, turned everything on an angle. These are all things that the modernists did in their graphic design. So this is probably a better example of using historical design vernacular to illustrate a timeline for a specific era. This is a timeline that you can find online. It's been floating around. Somebody designed this history of Western typefaces. So in the middle is the entire timeline. As you can see, it's very tall and thin. And on the left is a detail of the top of the poster. On the right is a detail of it's getting towards the end of the poster, not quite. It's about it's actually about the middle of the poster on the right hand side. So you can see they did a couple things here. They have a dual timeline that runs along both sides. They call out events pointing to both sides of this scale. They use a very simple color palette of this white, black, and red, and a common design vernacular. All of the years are treated the same. All of the images are treated the same. They're all inside of these circles. And this is a good way to make a bunch of very different visual information look more coherent. Now, the downside of this design, I think this really only works online. This works fine online because you can scale down, you can scale through the whole thing. I'm sorry, you can scroll through the whole thing, is what I meant to say. You can start at the top and slowly scroll your way down to the bottom, and it's fine. But if you picture this as an actual poster, you would have to either mount it on a scroll with a handle to rotate through, or you'd need it next to a ladder or something. For this to be any size that was at all legible, it would have to be like 12, 15 feet tall. So this is an example of, wouldn't really work that great as a poster, works fine online. This is an example, you can follow the link, but this is an example of a timeline that is designed for online presentation. What's great about this is that you can look at it as just a historical overview, or you can dive in more deeply to any of the events, any of the art movements. You can get as much information or as little information as you want out of this timeline. So the link is there. That is a live link in your PDF. I suggest you go check this website out. It's super cool, and it will actually be super useful to you in compiling the information for this project. And here are a few pieces of student work from other classes. Kathleen, the overall timeline is up at the top, and a detail is down at the bottom. So she did the simple timeline. Everything's on a diagonal. She's got a color gradation of this background color tint, and she did a simple icon for each item on the timeline. Great example of very simple but bold, clean design. Philip decided to use the interactive technology of QR codes. So, and he placed the QR codes as well as a very brief summary of each event into each letter of the title of his timeline. So the title is the timeline. And you access this by pointing your smartphone or other device at the QR code. The QR code takes you to some resource online that has more information about the particular event. So this is a great example of an interactive way of doing this. So it makes a kind of an interesting poster, but there's through smartphone technology and the internet, you can take a deeper dive into all of this information. Um, Tristan did a much more straightforward presentation, but just a beautiful job of presenting it. So she found these historical images or type specimens for each item in her timeline. She used a page grid and a consistent type treatment up the top, and this device of calling out each year and the title with this yellow highlight. You can see that she played a little bit with the hierarchy, that the title is actually in the lower right corner, which is a little unusual in terms of hierarchy, but she also made it very clear that's the title, through size, through positioning, through the highlight color. Paige decided to go with the format of a deck of cards. So each event is a card in this pack, and she built a box for them all to go in. So this is a fun, interesting, different approach. Lillian decided to zoom in on a very specific period in typographic history. She was talking just about the Bauhaus, which you may know it was a design school in Germany in the first part of the 20th century that has been hugely influential in modernist art and design. And her timeline really is, only a few decades, 1919 to 1933. She talks about typography. She uses some of the vernacular and some of the typefaces that were popular with the Bauhaus designers. And Juan created much more of an informational graphic. He used this hexagon approach for the images, and the images actually create the timeline with descriptions hanging from the left or the right-hand side. And then an overall image of metal type in the background. So as you can see, there's a wealth of options. There's the format is up to you. The actual events, the time period is up to you. The presentation is up to you. Basically, the constraints are off. I've given you a list of events that you can use or that can be starter events. Please read the brief over. Think about it carefully. We have a lot of time to do this project, but don't slack off in the beginning, because you will need all the time you have to do this project well. I see it every semester. Some students go, oh, I have a couple weeks to do this, and they don't do anything the first week. And those are invariably the students who get very bad grades on this at the end. You do need every bit of time that I'm giving you to do a good job on this project. The upside is, if you do a good job, this is absolutely a potential portfolio piece. So, read through the brief. Let me know if you have any questions. And good luck. I'm looking forward to see what you all come up with.